All right, time to do some research. Why am I reading this? Where is this going? What does this have to do with my research? What does it have to do with my life? Why am I here reading this instead of out drinking a beer in the sun? If you've ever asked yourself these questions when you're starting to read an academic paper, congratulations. It means that you're a human being who wants to feel that what you're reading is interesting, relevant, worth your time. Students ask these questions when teachers assign them readings for school. Teachers ask these questions when we're reading student papers. Yeah, and you know who else asks these questions? Editors of academic journals. Imagine having to read hundreds and hundreds of papers about pretty similar topics. How long do you think you'd spend on each one before you decide it's not worth your time? Readers of academic papers, whether we're students, teachers, editors, anyone, we want to feel right away in those first few sentences that the paper is making an important, interesting contribution to our field of research and to our lives. So how come so many of the papers that we read don't give us that feeling? I think there are two main reasons. Number one, the author doesn't show us why and how their work offers an interesting contrast to what we already know or assume. And number two, the author hasn't structured the introduction to their paper in a way that really highlights and dramatizes that interesting contrast. I'm Joe Lennon from the Masaryk University Writing Lab, and in this episode of my video series, 1 Hour to Improve Your Academic Writing, I'm going to give you some tips for thinking about and writing an introduction to your paper. First, I'll show you two concepts that might help you think a little bit better about what readers of an academic paper really want to see. And second, I'll show you one very well-known pattern or structure that you can use in the introduction to your paper to show your reader from the very start that you are giving them what they want. The first concept I want to show you is the concept of contrast. In order to capture our attention, something has to contrast with what's around it. If I colored the word contrast like this, you wouldn't be able to read it very well, and you might not even notice it at all. But if I color it with a strongly contrasting color like this, you're going to pay attention to it. Well, the same principle applies to a piece of academic writing. If you don't show some contrast between what you're saying or what you're doing and what your readers already know or assume about their field or about the world, no one is going to find it interesting. One of my favorite scientific articles about this idea is called "That's Interesting," and it was written by a sociologist named Murray. No, not that Murray. This was Murray S. Davis. The article was published back in 1971, but I think it's still pretty interesting. In the article, Davis gives his theory about what makes a scientific theory interesting. He starts by saying, a theorist is considered great not because his theories are true, but because they are interesting. And what does he mean by that? Well, he says, interesting theories are those which deny certain assumptions of their audience. And in the article, he labels about 24 different ways this can be done. For example, you could show that two variables that we assume have a positive correlation actually have a negative correlation. And for this, Davis gives the example of the sociologist David Kaplowitz, who argued in his book, The Poor Pay More, that goods and services are actually more expensive for poor people than they are for wealthy people. I'm not going to go into all of the 24 categories and examples that Davis mentions. You can read the paper yourself, and I really recommend that you do that. But besides defining all these different ways of being interesting, he also outlines 3 ways an academic claim or proposition can be uninteresting. The first way is if the proposition affirms what the audience already assumes to be the case. Davis's examples are a little bit out of date. Remember, the article is from 1971. So I'll give you my own more modern examples. And here's one that I've seen some version of in quite a few papers recently. Social media has had a huge influence on 21st century society. Wow, yeah. Davis says the audience will respond to this kind of claim by saying, that's obvious. The second kind of uninteresting proposition is one that doesn't relate at all to any aspect of the audience's assumptions. So they don't see how it could affect their work or their activity at all. For example, The Atlanta Braves hit 4 more home runs in 2022 than they did in 2021. The audience's response, especially if the audience is my girlfriend, will be, "That's irrelevant," or "So what?" or "Who cares?" Third, an audience will consider a proposition to be non-interesting if it completely denies all of their basic assumptions. For example, a person's physical surroundings have absolutely no effect on their behavior. To something like that, the audience will respond, "That's absurd." I find those 3 audience responses that Davis describes very relevant as a teacher of academic writing because, honestly, these are sometimes the responses I have when I read my students' work. And that's why I'm making this video, because I want to help student writers see what they can do to avoid leaving their readers uninterested and asking, "Why am I reading this?" The important insight that we can take from Davis is that what's interesting is relative. He writes, "Propositions are interesting or uninteresting only in relation to the assumption ground of some audience." That means that unfortunately, our amazing results, our beautiful numbers and data sets, these are not objectively exciting or interesting. In order to make them exciting and interesting to our reader, we have to show a contrast between what the reader already knows or thinks they know and what our research offers. Now, when I say what the reader knows, another way of understanding that, especially if we're talking about scientific work, is what the reader already knows about the work that's going on in the field, what other people have said and done before I came along and offered my research. Because after all, in scientific work, what has been said and done by other researchers is exactly what has established, or at least helped to establish, the assumptions of my readers. And that brings me to the second concept that I want to share with you, and that is the metaphor of the sandbox. Yep, I mean that box of sand that we all played in as kids. And in this metaphor, the sandbox is your research field, or the topic of interest that you're writing about. And the kid is you, the researcher. And if a sandbox is an academic field, then we should imagine a really big sandbox with a bunch of other kids doing things as well. It's not just you in this sandbox. So here you are doing your thing in your sandbox. Maybe you're digging a hole and piling up the sand. And there are other kids playing near you, and some of them are doing different work that's necessary for the work you're doing. Maybe some kid has just brought to the sandbox some newer, bigger shovel that saves you time in your digging. Now you can dig twice as fast. And of course, some kids are doing things that use your work to do their work. Maybe they're taking your pile of sand and making a sandcastle. Unfortunately, there are some kids who are doing work that actually goes against the work you're doing. Maybe there's some kid filling in the hole that you're making. And you're mad because you think, well, that's not what they should be doing. They should be helping me. If they were helping me, the whole sandbox would be a much better place. But of course, that kid who's filling in your hole probably thinks the same thing about you, that they're the ones doing it the right way and you're doing it wrong. So if we asked you to describe your work in the sandbox, we would expect you to say something about these relationships, describe how your work fits into the larger dynamic going on around you. To bring the metaphor back to real life, when we read your academic paper that describes your work, we want to read your explanation of how your work relates to the other work that's going on in the field. And that's because we want to see how your work contrasts with the other work. Now, obviously, the work you're doing, as well as how much you're able to describe the bigger picture of the work going on in the sandbox, depends on how advanced you are in the field. If you're a PhD student or a professor or beyond, your readers will expect you to be asking and answering very high-level questions about how the whole sandbox is being organized and run. And you might even be getting into some very existential questions about the sandbox itself, like, where does our sandbox end and the next sandbox begin? Or should we even be in this sandbox? Or should we be in another sandbox? Or, hey, should we replace the sand in our sandbox with svichkova sauce? Obviously, if you're an undergraduate just starting out in your field, no one expects you to be dealing with such high-level questions about your whole field. But we do expect you to be starting to make connections and contrasts between your work and other people's work. Maybe at the simplest level, you're just referring to the work of one other kid next to you. And you're saying, well, I'm doing the same kind of work as they're doing, but I'm doing it with a different kind of sand or a different tool. The point is, when you describe your work in the sandbox, you're relating your work to the work of others in your field. So maybe now you see how the two concepts I've talked about, the sandbox and the idea of contrast, work together. When we're reading an academic paper, whether we're students, teachers, editors, whoever, we want the author of the paper to describe their work in the sandbox in a way that brings out an interesting contrast to what we know about the sandbox and what we know about the work that's already being done there. We want the author to do these things because they help us see that the work the author is doing is relevant and grounded, but most of all, interesting. And if you agree with me that this is what you want when you're reading, then I hope you agree that this is also what you should be providing when you're writing. You may say, all this sounds great, Joe, but what if I don't know what my audience knows or assumes? And that's a very good point, because we often don't know what our audience knows, or we can't quite guess what they would assume. And this is very often the case if you're writing to an audience outside your field who hasn't read all the things that you've read. But it's also very often the case if you're new to your field, if you're in your first year of university, let's say, or you're taking a course in a new discipline, and you haven't read all the things that your audience might have read. So it's hopeless, right? Unless I'm already an expert in my field or I'm some kind of mind reader, I won't be able to give my audience something that will challenge their assumptions and really interest them. If only there were some way to show my reader what assumptions I'm starting from, so that no matter who they are or what they know, they will appreciate how my work contrasts with those assumptions. Yeah, if only there were some way to introduce the ideas that my work is challenging or contrasting with. Yeah, some sort of, introduction to what's missing or what's problematic in my field, so that it's clear how my research contributes something important and interesting. All right. So, enough theory, because it's one thing to know about these concepts and another to actually use them in your paper. And I promised I'd give you a structure, a pattern that would help you do that in the first few sentences of your paper. So here it is, and it's called the CARS model. And CARS stands for Creating a Research Space. And this is a very well-known model. It was originally developed by the linguist John Swales way back in the 1980s, and it's been modified in many ways since then, but the basic model is still very popular. And actually, part of the reason he developed the model was to help non-native writers in English, who might not be used to the structural expectations of English language writing. Swales looked at the introduction sections to many research papers in biology and medicine and social science, and he found that most authors did three things in the introduction section, and he called these three things moves. The first move Swales called establishing a territory, and this move has a couple of closely related actions: showing that the field of study is important and explaining the current state of the knowledge in the field. The second move he called establishing a niche, and Swales uses this word niche, which is a nice metaphor for a small little area that you've carved out for your study. Move 2 means pointing out a gap in the previous research and raising a problem that needs to be solved. After an author has established their niche, Swales found that they occupy the niche. They state the actions and goals of the present study, and they announce the principal findings of the study. When I introduce these three moves to my students, I like to put them into the form of questions that the reader might ask, and therefore the writer probably should answer in their introduction. For move number 1, why is this topic important, and what do we know so far? For move number 2, where's the problem or question, and what's missing in our current knowledge? And for move number 3, what are we doing or what are we going to do to solve the problem or answer the question? Okay, I'm going to show you what these moves might look like in actual pieces of writing. But first, let's take a moment to appreciate this idea of thinking about the structure of your writing in terms of moves, because this is one of the cool ideas that Swales brought to his field. I love that word moves and this concept of moves because it gives the sense of the author taking action with their words and doing something in their paper. And it also suggests that the author is moving the reader mentally into a certain position, a certain vantage point from which the reader can really see and appreciate what the writer is going to do in their paper. The great thing about seeing the structure of your paper in terms of moves is that once you learn how to identify these moves in different papers that you read and recognize them, then you start to see them in many different kinds of texts, and you start to see that they can be accomplished in many different ways, with different language, sometimes in a different order, but they're very often there in some form. And learning to recognize those moves makes it easier to see some different ways you can accomplish these moves and adapt them for use in whatever you're writing. I'm going to show you 3 published academic texts where we can see these 3 moves of cars being used in different ways. Let's start with a very short, efficient, almost textbook example of the cars model. And this comes from a very recent medical research letter in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Here is the whole introduction section to the article, and you can see it's just 4 sentences. Pause the video, read the intro, and see if you can identify the 3 cars moves in it. Medical research articles are maybe the best place to see the 3 cars moves in their ideal form. In the first 2 sentences, we get the first move, establishing the territory. The authors start immediately with references to previous studies, previous knowledge. They're showing us what other researchers in the Sandbox have been working on. Also, in these first 2 sentences, the writers use words that really make us feel the importance of the issue. Increased risk, severe disease. The authors are really emphasizing that the field they are working in is dealing with some serious threats to human health and life. In the third sentence, that however is a clear, very obvious signal that now we're getting to some kind of contrast to what came before. And the phrase, "it is unclear," directly tells us there's a problem, a gap in our knowledge. So this is move 2, establishing a niche. And then finally, in that last sentence, the pronoun we is a clear signal that the authors will now tell us what they will do to try to fill the gap. We get a very clear and strong sense that the authors have done something that needs to be done in this field and hasn't been done fully. This is move 3, occupying the niche. In this case, this very short and simplistic introduction, I wouldn't say the authors are super heavily stressing the contrast of what they're doing. And yet they are showing the contrast in some little subtle ways, these signal phrases and the structure of the intro. So both the language and the structure of the intro are moving the reader into a position from which they can appreciate the importance and the interest of the work that these researchers are doing. And in this case, they're doing it extremely efficiently in just 4 sentences. The next example I want to show you is not an introduction section. It's actually an abstract from a political science research paper. But if you think about it, an abstract is a kind of introduction to your paper, and abstracts very often show the 3 cars moves also. So again, pause the video, read the abstract, and see if you can identify the 3 moves. I'd say the first sentence shows us move 1, why this issue is important and what we know about it so far. We're told that millions of people don't fill out the whole ballot when they vote. That's a lot of people, so a lot of potential for politicians and activists to get more votes. The second sentence shows us move 2. What is the problem that needs to be solved? What is the question that we need to answer? And in this example, we get a very direct statement that this is a puzzle. Nice metaphor there that really makes us feel that something needs to be solved. And also we get a direct question. And the essence of move 2 really is a question, so it makes sense that we get it in the form of a question. And with moves 1 and 2 finished in the first 2 sentences, all that's left is move 3. Most of this abstract is talking about the present study, what the authors of this paper actually did. And you'll notice, in this case, the authors go ahead and give us the results of their study, their takeaway point. And you will see this sometimes in abstracts and intros, but not always, and that's something that really depends on the journal and what editors and readers expect. Okay, let's go to the last example, and I thought it would be cool to look at one of the most famous scientific papers of all time, and that's the 1953 paper, a structure for deoxyribose nucleic acid. And this, of course, was the first publication of James Watson and Francis Crick's proposal of the double helix structure of DNA, for which they later won the Nobel. The whole paper is very short, about a page long, as it appeared in the journal Nature, and it doesn't have a separate introduction section, but let's look at the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. And again, how about you pause the video and see if you can identify the car's moves in the opening part of this paper. Did you notice something a little bit different here than what we saw in the 2 previous examples? I would say those first 2 sentences, which are one short paragraph, I would say those are move 3, actually, because we get that phrase, "we wish to suggest." The authors are saying very directly right at the start what they are going to contribute in the paper. And I love that second sentence so much because Watson and Crick are not at all shy about saying that what they've discovered is novel and of considerable interest to their field. That's quite a bold claim, but they back it up with what comes next. And here we can see moves 1 and 2. And again, the structure they use for these next 2 paragraphs is very simple and very specific. In each paragraph, they begin with move 1, describing quickly the DNA structures that previous researchers have put forward, and naming those previous researchers directly. So they are describing the work that has been done in the sandbox around them, and then immediately criticizing these proposals with a move 2, calling these previous proposals unsatisfactory and ill-defined. So again, this is extremely strong language, we might think, but after all, this is in the field of molecular biology where if you get your math wrong, you're just wrong. So Watson and Crick feel quite confident that they are more right, at least, than their rivals Pauling and Fraser. And then after describing and criticizing their colleagues' work in the sandbox, they come back with another strong move 3 statement, there in green. We wish to put forward a radically different structure. And again, that phrase, radically different. Wow, they're really pushing the contrast between their work and the previous knowledge and the assumptions of their readers. So we can see in this famous paper a little bit of a different ordering and arranging of the 3 moves, but they're still there. And that variation is something that we can see in a lot of papers still today. A lot of papers might have the 3 moves in a different order. Maybe move 3 comes first, for example, and then we might go back and forth a few times between the different moves before the end of the introduction. Okay, so I've shown you the CARS model for academic introductions, and I've shown you a few examples of how it works in real academic articles. So when you read your next research paper, take a moment and look closely at the introduction and see if you can find these 3 moves. And if you get better at reading and noticing how papers in your field show these moves, then I think bit by bit you'll get better at writing papers with more effective and exciting introductions, which show your readers what's been going on in the sandbox around you so they can appreciate the contrast between the work that's already been done, the ideas that are motivating your research, and your research. And so you're showing your readers right away why your work has the potential to change their minds. And after all, that's what we want to do, right? We want to change the way our readers think about the field and give them something that's really interesting. Otherwise, why are we writing? Okay, that's all for this installment of 1 hour to improve your academic writing. But check out the other videos in the series. And if you're working on a piece of writing in English and would like to consult with me or another writing specialist, go to our website to make an appointment with us. See you at the Writing Lab.